So today we're going to be talking about Neoclassicism. I mentioned last week in the introduction that Neoclassicism is a period in time that ushers in the 19th century. It actually starts really the latter half of the 18th century, but it is also, of course, still ongoing during the beginning of the 19th century. So this is where we're going to start before we get into Romanticism, which is perhaps the most dominant period of the 19th century. But Neoclassicism is still definitely worthwhile and definitely worth studying. So a good theme for Neoclassicism is return to reason. You get more frivolous periods throughout history. It always seems to be a more frivolous, secular, you could even say more sinful period. And then there's always a reactionary period after that is a bit more strict and what have you, and reasonable, as we'll see here. And then they kind of just go back and forth. Right now, I would definitely say we are not in a time of reason. But just before Neoclassicism is the Rococo period. And Rococo art, to reflect the period, is very aristocratic, very frivolous, very sexual in many regards too. Kind of subtle in that regards, not like pornographic, but definitely different than what we're going to get in Neoclassicism. And Neoclassicism is largely a response to that. Neoclassicism, if you can't tell by the title, is the new classics, essentially. And what are the classics? The classical period is largely the Greco-Roman times, so Greece and Rome, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And that's largely where we're going to be looking for inspiration. This is the age of the Enlightenment, which is a term you may have also be acquainted with. The Enlightenment is largely philosophical movement and ideology, but of course, lots of the ideas permeate through different mediums, including the art we're going to see. So logic is a big thing to these people at the time, logic and virtue. And this is also when we see the birth of modern science that coincides with the Enlightenment. And it's largely based on empiricism. People like John Locke, who's very, very foundational for the philosophy that we get for lots of the United States founding documents. And then David Hume's a big empiricist as well. And then we also just a big focus on logic, virtue, morality, what have you. And we're going to try to return to reason, essentially. Considering this is neoclassical, can you guys think of any perhaps other classical revival periods? Because there have been others. This is not necessarily unique in that regards. Just to give you an idea. So this is the Apollo Belvedere. This is actually a Roman copy of a Greek statue, which is very common. The Romans copied a lot of Greek statues. So the original was, as you see here, was crafted around 350 BC, and then the Romans, this version at least, this copy was in around the year 120. And so this actually was bought by a pope, Paul III, and he bought it to decorate a niche in his courtyard, which he just had a lot of statues. And he did that around, so obviously this is an old statue. It was dug up around 1540, and so that's when he got it and he put it in his gardens. And it was found in the gardens surrounding the mausoleum of Hadrian, which is the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. And so actually, initially when they found it, they thought it was a statue of Antonius, who was pretty much Emperor Hadrian's lover. We could just call him the favorite. And so this that 120 period, this definitely comes from Hadrian's time period. In some regards, I'm not sure why it's called Apollo, because this is Hermes. It's a depiction of Hermes in his role as Psychopompos, which is he shows the awaiting deceased people into the underworld, the dead souls into the underworld. And so he's awaiting the deceased here, and it's supposed to get a sense of melancholy. His gaze is slightly lowered, but this is his traveling cloak thrown over his arm here. But then also about 1,000 years after this stuff was dug up, we get the artists of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is simply Renaissance means rebirth. And rebirth, like, what is it a rebirth of? It's literally just meant to be like a rebirth of the classics. We've improved upon it in our own regard, as the thought is, because we made it Christian. But the idea is still to revive the Greek and Roman art and make it even better than the art back then. A few 100 years after that, we're still doing stuff like that. We're still doing classical art a couple hundred years after the Renaissance as well. It comes and goes. Lots of artists don't necessarily focus on it. It's a big thing during like the early Renaissance, but especially perhaps during the High Renaissance in Italy, and but among other places as well. This is a famous guy right here, Nicolas Poussin. He's during the Baroque era. So I mentioned how before Neoclassicism we get the Rococo, and before Rococo we get the Baroque era. So he's a Baroque classicist. And this is the death of Germanicus. And he thought the art of the Baroque era was too frivolous, so that pretty much Baroque painting should be serious like classical art. So he's like the founder of Baroque classicism. And then even like 100 years after that, we still have people yearning essentially for the idea of classical art, which they associated with like dignity and heroicism. And so pretty much we like the art of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We like the art of the Renaissance. We even like the art of Poussin. Let's make some more classical art. And so that's what we're going to get, and they're going to call it Neoclassicism. So, and here is a neoclassical sculpture by Canova, Perseus with the head of Medusa. You can see the influences, I would hope. I think it's relatively aware. Maybe not in our visual culture do we think of it still being influenced by Greek and Roman art, but it's still definitely there today as well. Even like the whole standard of beauty we have is largely a Roman standard. So, and this is, I guess, more contemporary. This is from the 80s, which predates me. So this work predates me by 12 years, but this is definitely still very classically inspired. So, been very important. And some good characteristics, some good things to note down for characteristics of neoclassical art. So you'll find that lots of work is hard to pin down into a movement or a period, and then some of them are easier, and even if they are recognizably part of that period, they won't always have all of these descriptors, but these descriptors are generally pretty accurate. For neoclassical art, we get a lot of planarity, usually relatively frontal plane here, not too much going on in the background, lots of simple backdrops, not always the case. Linearity, which is actually relatively typical from the Renaissance, to be honest, but we get a lot of tight brushwork. We're not going to get super loose brushwork until we get to like the Impressionist, but even some romantic works that we'll see later, their brushwork is way looser, and generally the tighter the brushwork, the more realistic it looks, the more photorealistic it looks. We get very even lighting. We don't get too much dramatic lighting. Very sculptural forms. The people look realistic. They're definitely being inspired by, classical sculpture. So the forms themselves look heavily inspired by that. But we also get a lot of classical figures, dress, and themes, which is fair enough, and tend to be more serious, moralistic subjects. And then definitely a good term for neoclassical work as well is just austerity. They kind of think highly of themselves. There are some problems that you can identify with the Enlightenment period, and it doesn't necessarily go to plan, to put simply. But the artwork is still worth looking at too as well. I mean, studying the Enlightenment is still worth looking at as well. But one of the things that inspired this, it's not just the frivolity of the age before them during the Rococo period. There's also cool stuff happening, right? Here's Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius in the background, and it was discovered in 1738. So this had been recently discovered near Napoli, Italy, and it was discovered because some workers were laying some foundations for a residence for the king of Naples, and That same year, they also uncovered Herculaneum, which is another town that was in the same time Pompeii was destroyed by the Vesuvius eruption. Herculaneum was as well, and it was pretty much adjacent to Pompeii. A little bit smaller, and I think the pyroclastic flows there were quite a bit hotter and stuff like that. I'm not sure the corpses kind of, survived the way they did in Pompeii, but this definitely helped spark interest in the classical antiquity. And if you're not aware, Vesuvius erupted in the year 79 on August 24th. And it wasn't covered with lava. That's why it's perhaps, they could dig it up relatively easily. But with the pyroclastic flow, as I kind of mentioned, so it's kind of that gas with the ash. Usually quite hot, like 300 plus degrees Celsius. And everyone pretty much died instantly, like when that hit them. So they just dropped where they were. And Herculaneum was hotter, and we know that partially because the bodies weren't preserved as well. Some of the heads were just blown off. It was pretty rough. But then the ash covered the bodies decomposed, it made the cavities, and then they filled them with plaster. That's why we get those plaster casts. The archaeologists filled them with plaster when they were first looking at this, pretty much. So this helped spark it. And I mean, I feel like that's cool enough. We even think Pompeii is pretty interesting today. Can you imagine when it was first discovered almost 300 years ago? That'd be pretty exciting. This guy is also kind of important, I guess. He's the first, he wrote what a lot of people consider the first art history book. And that was during this period as well. There are obviously some other stuff, like Lives of the Artist by Vasari is kind of considered art historical, but it's largely biographical about artists, and lots of it's not even true. Lots of it's kind of hearsay. It's interesting. It's worth reading. That's that's late Renaissance writing. That one Vasari is. This is a portrait of Johann Joachim Winckelmann. So he is the guy who wrote the book. And the painting, of course, the portrait is Raphael Ming's, and he wrote the history of Greek art. And he really praised it for its noble simplicity and calm grandeur. And generally speaking, thought that of ancient art. And when they say ancient art, they definitely mean what we would consider the Western tradition. So Egyptian stuff, lots of Near Eastern stuff like Mesopotamian, Tigris, Euphrates valleys would be included in that. But definitely the Greeks and the Romans as well. So, and this portrait was posthumous, painted posthumously, so it's kind of idealized. And this actually a model. It's not himself. The artist and the model were friends, and they just painted it to kind of look like Winckelmann. So, and he's actually holding a book, which is the Greek edition of the Iliad. Maybe I should learn Greek so I could read the Iliad in Greek, but it's alluding to pretty much his scholarliness, of course. I mean, this is what we get with portraits. I always think portraits are relatively, in my opinion, often the most boring. They're a bit more exciting when they're sculpted for some reason, but unless it's like a family portrait or something like that, I don't know. I don't really care that much. Of course, I'm gonna interject my own opinions like that. Of course, please feel free to disagree with me. In fact, you should not agree with me on everything. But regardless, in fact, actually, that's something that I would really like. Would just be pay a painter to paint me and my family or whatever. It'd be cool. But obviously, it's just alluding to his scholarliness and his kind of ties to classical poetry. But it did become very fashionable for young Northern Europeans, generally young Northern European aristocrats, of course, they're the ones who could afford it, to visit places like Paris, Venice, Florence, and above all, Rome. We're going to start doing the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour has actually already been happening for a while by aristocrats. It's just we're going to start to see more and more interested in the classical stuff to visit, not just for the sake of going on a vacation necessarily. So it's kind of the culmination of a young aristocrat's classical education. You definitely got a classical, really good education if you could afford it, and this was just a good way to solidify that. Go actually see the places you've learned about. And this is just a painting of ancient Rome. Shows a lot of stuff. I don't know how many there are and who's paying attention. If anyone could name anything from the imagery. I can't name all of it, certainly not. But lots of this, none of this is fabricated. This is all stuff that These are all actual monuments and ruins that you can find in Rome, pretty much. Except for, of course, the hall that it is depicted in. But it's pretty much just the Grand Tour just gave like this concrete form for the Northern Europeans' ideas about the Greco-Roman world. And it did definitely help foster those neoclassical ideals. And even some of these tourists visited excavations. Like they would go to the excavations at Pompeii, Herculaneum, Tivoli, and they would purchase antiquities from the excavation sites to decorate their own homes. Which you're definitely not allowed to do anymore. But still. But just to point out some of these, the top left here, but not the far left, because I don't know the far left ones, but the general top left one with those two columns and the big coffered dome behind it with the oculus, that's the dome of the Pantheon in Rome. And then there's a couple arches. I'm not sure which of the arches are which. Titus is a pretty famous one, but there are several other ones. This guy on the left, bottom left, leaning on something, who's really massively ripped, that's Hercules. And then the guy to his right, who's lying down, dying, that's the dying Gaul. And then on the far right, bottom right side, that statue with the guy and the two smaller dudes struggling with the serpents is Laocoon and his sons, which is a Trojan story. So like Iliad. You can see, of course, the outside of the Pantheon, the Colosseum, more temples and arches and stuff like that. There's the column of Trajan on the far right above Laocoon. There's also the Basilica of Constantine in between the Pantheon and the Colosseum one, that more narrow one. You guys can't see my mouse, so this is an engraving. Engravings were a more affordable way of for people having art, which is, I mean, fair enough. This is Gavin Hamilton. If you don't recognize surname Hamilton, that's a Scottish name, and he was a Scottish painter and dealer. He dealt in antiquities in Rome. So, I mean, because that was, again, a big business for the tourists on the Grand Tour. So this is the Andromache bewailing the death of Hector, which, of course, if you're not aware, Hector is the prince of Troy, dies during the Trojan War. And so this is supposed to be the missing ingredient of Parnassus. So he's like adding what they're missing in the paintings, essentially, by painting deathbed scenes that showed self-sacrifice. Also, just like the subject, taken from Homer, of course, Andromache. I'm not actually exactly sure how they're supposed to. Andromache sounds about right. Her husband, she's the wife of Hector, and of course he had been killed by Achilles, a Greek hero, very famous Greek hero. So this painting actually, of course, was originally not an engraving, but it's reproduced widely as an engraving. This is an engraving version of it. Of course, it's more muted. It's kind of like, just black and white, essentially. But this is definitely different than, like, Rococo period before it, than its fantasy and pleasure, because they did tours as well. They're coming to Rome to find pleasure. They're not coming to Rome to find a moralistic depiction of Hector dying and his loyal wife, his spouse. So it's kind of just supposed to show, like, the loyalty of a spouse, dedication, essentially, like virtue, as opposed to, vice, marital indiscretion, deception. The women themselves, though, are mostly kind of either like passive, kind of maybe helpless, grieving. But this is also, we looked at it for just a second, the Death of Germanicus by Poussin. You could probably see the inspiration from that a bit, and it was definitely that influenced this. That was about 140 years before this. Yeah, we're definitely turning towards more of a moralistic subject matter. This one is very famous, perhaps one of the most recognizable ones we'll look at. This is by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Hierati. So he was a student of Boucher, who was a Rococo painter. Just to give you a little idea on the story, again, to give you the moral idea, is the Hierati were Roman brothers. There are three of them on the left. And they were going to war with Alba, which was a neighboring tribe, essentially. And not the Scottish Alba. And there were three brothers representing Alba called the Curati, and they went to war. They just pretty much to decide the conflict, which it actually didn't really do. It was like a 3v3 battle to the death. And the Hierati won, but only one of the brothers survived. We get some grieving women on the side because some of the Hierati sisters were betrothed to some of the Curati brothers. And the story is actually that the Hirati brother that survives, the sole survivor of the six-man conflict, when he comes home, his sister is waiting by the gate to see if they come home. Because if they come home, obviously her love is dead. And she sees her brother and cries, and he kills her. And then he's tried in court, and they acquit him. Pretty much no tears for the enemy. Yeah, it's supposed to be depicted here nobly, the more uplifting. Again, kind of those moral scenes. A little bit about David himself. His father was killed in a duel, so he was raised by his uncles, who were architects. And they wanted him to be an architect as well, and perhaps you can see the architectural influence with the nice framing of the arch by the arches and columns in the background. But he was definitely disillusioned by the French court, and he wanted to paint not what the French court liked, so that's why he wanted to paint these more noble, uplifting, moral stuff. He likes his paintings to be clear, precise, kind of easy to read. He definitely did study in Rome as well. And this is a 13 feet by 13 feet painting, so it's pretty large. We do like the big, larger historical paintings. And he actually painted it while he was in Rome. And this work definitely did become an immediate sensation. He essentially is the most important painter of the Neoclassical period. He's the most important painter of his lifetime. I mean, good for him, right? But it's an image of the Roman past, but it spoke directly to like the contemporary situation in France, kind of just like a call for liberty, a new moral order. We don't like the monarchy. But the composition is very simple and yet striking. We got a lot of hard lines, very austere space. We get stark columns. These are the Tuscan columns, which is a Roman version of like the Greek Doric column. But we get a very firm stance, contrasted again with the mourning women. So it's like this personal loss versus the greater good of society. But again, it's that country above your personal feelings for family. An interesting thought, but there it is. This is one regard where the lighting's a bit more harsh, a bit more dramatic, mostly on the three figures on the left. But we're casting a very precise shadows. We're definitely looking at artists before us. Caravaggio is probably the most famous for his use of light and shadow. But the costumes were actually carefully researched and studied, trying to show that he knows what he's talking about and knows what he's doing. This is kind of like the quintessential neoclassical picture. But also kind of this, we get this horror of impending violence and bloodbath. And almost some undercurrents of romanticism with that nationalism that's even still popular during romanticism. And this will be influential in the start of the French Revolution. Although, and David will become a revolutionary himself, he was not a revolutionary when he painted this. There's a detail. You can see the detail in it. And this is pretty much eye level, actually, at the Louvre. It's at the Louvre in Paris. And again, here's this comic, showed you guys in the introduction. And you look at this bottom middle panel, just to show that, some art is actually, referenced in popular culture. But the bottom middle panel is based on this work, also by David. And this is again also in the Louvre. So this is the death of Marat, 1793. So actually a tiny bit before the 19th century. But by about 1791, David became an active in the cause of the French Revolution, which began in 1789. So I guess it took him about a couple years to get on board. But he ended up essentially becoming a painter for the revolution and even for the new regime afterwards. And this is his most famous portrait of this period. This is a leader of the revolution and also a close friend of David's. So there are really two factions in the revolution. Marat was a member of a Jacobin party, David as well, of course, and then there was a lady named Charlotte Corday. She was also an aristocrat, but she was part of the Girondist. I don't know actually how to say it. Girondist, who actually brought him a fake petition, and then stabbed him in the chest while he was reading it. And this is his portable desk over his bathtub. That's where we're seeing him in, if you couldn't tell. And this is actually where he spent most of his time. He had a sickness, a lethal skin condition, but this is pretty stark. We get the background is pretty much non-existent. That's pretty indicative of looking at some Baroque artists like Zurbarán, Spanish artist, who we have not looked at. But a lot of attention to detail, of course, which is pretty typical of Neoclassicism. We get the very sharp lighting. Again, supposed to indicate moral and intellectual virtue, but it's also not accurate. So this, like Himvar was saying, This is literally propaganda. This is what this is. His bathroom was actually quite lavish. It was not bare like this, and Marat was actually supposed to be really ugly, like supposed to be really unattractive apparently in real life, and so we did not paint him that way. And especially considering he had the skin condition, he doesn't necessarily, it doesn't, you don't see that here either. So we're idealizing him. And writing crate is supposed to be indicative of a tombstone, fair enough. And Marat is even posed like Christ. Like there's a lot of famous paintings of like the deposition of Christ when he's taken off from the cross. And so he's supposed to, and I mean, and he does, he's posed like that. But we get the planarity. It's pretty much like in our face, very frontal. Kind of horrific though, and kind of get this level of intensity. And this is very signature of David. It is, of course, a bit romanticized. With that idealization, it's not accurate. Though, so I mean, happens. And it's also a bit Baroque in that regard. We get the bloody knife down here on the bottom left. It's in our face again, but it's also, he's kind of just portrayed as like a heroic martyr to the cause of freedom. So, although it's propaganda, is it justified to a degree? Because I mean, I think when we think of propaganda today, it's just like blatant lies. Now, this actually happened. It's just we made it a bit more appealing. He's not as ugly. We're not distracted and perhaps a little dissuaded because of how lavish his bathroom actually was and stuff like that. So, there's some things to think about. This is a very famous one. We're not really going to talk about it, but this is David as well. Napoleon at the St. Bernard Pass. Very heroic. Very good, to be honest, too. So you can see that the revolutionary in David. Here's painting Napoleon. And here's another one, the coronation of Napoleon. These crowded ones have never really done it for me too much. But you can get an idea of what like the court may have been like. And even with a lot of people going on, you can still see the texture in lots of these fancier robes and stuff like pretty well, especially this like priest directly in front of Napoleon with like holding up the cross. Is he holding up the cross? Yes, he is. He's got some strong forearms. But yeah. Either way, that's it. Just also kind of gives you an idea of just the variety of paintings. We're gonna be barely scratching the surface. Mostly looking at perhaps some of the most famous, if not perhaps most just influential paintings from the period. But there are a lot of other artists to look at. And that's true for pretty much any period. Okay, this guy's pretty good though, and good, worth knowing. This is Benjamin West. And this is The Death of General Wolfe, painted in 1770. So this is a history painting, and it's a contemporary history painting. This is an Englishman, Benjamin West, but he was actually born and raised outside of Philadelphia. So he's a British colonist in the Americas. And he went to Rome in 1760, so about 10 years prior to this. Studied with Mings, Gavin Hamilton, and studied ancient art and Raphael. Raphael's lots of people are big fans of Raphael. And he ended up settling in London in 1763, and was also a founding member of the Royal Academy in London in 1768. And although its original president is Joshua Reynolds, he's the president after Reynolds. And he actually is kind of like a big mentor for American artists. And he was proud actually of his New World heritage, and he supported the American Revolution despite being a Londoner at that point. But this is actually a depiction from the French and Indian War. So a North American war. If you aren't American, French and Indian War is pretty much the Brits and the French fighting each other in Quebec, Canada, largely. And they pretty much both had different Indian tribes allied with him. But this isn't really classical in subject. The costumes are not classical. These are contemporary costumes. And it is classical in spirit, though, if you understand what I'm saying. So General Wolfe was actually like considered a national hero in Britain. And this is supposed to be the moment he sacrificed his life for his country. Again, the pose is kind of like the deposition of Christ coming off the cross. So we're definitely doing that on purpose. We're shifting the emotions kind of from religion to nationalism, though. And we're also using these forces of nature to reinforce the emotional intensity. As you can see, the smoke from the guns over here on the left kind of turns into the clouds, and the clouds darken pretty heavily as you get to the right. Pretty much starkly changes with him where he's dead. To the right of him is very dark. In fact, the clouds kind of like swoop down like this, kind of like he does as well. Very good design, but it's supposed to, again, reinforce that emotional intensity. This was very much loved by the public. So, and it was, again, it's treated like a historical painting, but it's kind of like a contemporary historical painting, because this actually happened about 7 years prior to the painting. And this is, of course, before photography and film. And, yeah. So it's a historic painting, but it's not really necessarily historically accurate. Of course, this is idealized. And we also do throw in an Indian in the bottom left here. We like Rousseau and his noble savage. So throw in the Native American. Another guy, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, as he is called. I'm actually really bad with French names, so just understand that if I say a French name, I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. But this is the village bride, or the marriage, the moment when a father gives his son-in-law a dowry. Okay, you read that. And this is a good example of Neoclassicism in France. So this is a French genre painting. And if you aren't aware of what genre painting is, if you're just joining me for this course, genre paintings are just a painting of like everyday life, essentially. It's supposed to be less idealized, more representing, and not just like everyday life for aristocrats, everyday life for your average person, like peasant folk, essentially. This was a sensation, though, when he painted this at the Paris Salon. And the Paris Salon's pretty much the biggest exhibition. Members of the Royal Academies. It was always held in the Louvre. And they would just pack it with paintings. And thousands of people from all classes of society would actually go and watch it. And this kind of when we get the beginning of like art critics and stuff, too. But some elements that kind of make it more neoclassical. This kind of supposed to be virtuous ideas, family life, the sister and mother who are kind of clinging on to the bride to be. And if we are like, they're represented as like modest, kind of, you get the idea that they're hardworking, probably religious, they're definitely lower class. Again, that from Rousseau, there was a general idea that the poor are full of natural virtue and honest sentiment, and which may or may not be wrong. You can think that for yourself. So this kind of just corresponds with the ideals of Rousseau. So the naive poor are just closer to nature and are thus more virtuous and moral than the more cultivated aristocracy. But to be honest, when you see like the degeneracy of lots of the aristocrats, I mean, I guess it's not hard to come to that conclusion. But people felt that the emotions and the gestures in this painting were very authentic, especially when you do look at someone like Poussin. Some of the problems with Poussin is like we like the classical ideals and stuff like that, but it's very stiff. It doesn't feel very real in that regard. So, and this feels real. So perhaps we are improving on it. Okay, Joshua Reynolds. So he is the first president of the British Arts Academy, pretty much, the Royal Academy of Art in London. And he studied in Rome as well. He returned to London with the goal pretty much of elevating art, like British art as well. And he liked the idea of history painting, grand manner of neoclassical stuff. And this is actually Lady Sarah Bunbury sacrificing to the Graces, as you can see in the title. She is a contemporary lady. This is a very classical depiction of her, though. He was kind of financially forced to do portraiture. It paid pretty well because you get wealthy patrons paying for it. History painting probably would have been his preference, but it wasn't really all that popular in England at the time. So he kind of elevates the portraiture by giving the classical poses again and references. So we get the three Graces up here in the top left, based on, of course, a well-known Hellenistic sculpture, which we do that a lot. We get the ancient drapery. This is, of course, not contemporary. Would not be wearing this in 1765. And then we also get the architecture. It seems like she's standing beneath or near an arch, and even the urn. Like those are all classical. Those are not contemporary as well. But it's supposed to be kind of like a symbol of friendship, almost essentially. Here's just another idea. This one is this was 1790, obviously, so during the neoclassical period. But this is like very, very obviously, Greek inspired. Hercules in the Garden of the Hesperides. This is very much like the motifs in the pediment of temples, Greek temples. You would have depictions like this. And again, here's another flaxman, Achilles mourning Patroclus. We like it. It sells during this time too, so other people like it, of course. Also a good guy to know, Jean-Antoine Houdon, another Frenchman. Voltaire seated. Voltaire is also someone you should definitely know if you do not know. There are a couple of these, actually. There is one in the LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art. It's closer than the Louvre for me, although I've also never been to the LACMA. But depicting Voltaire kind of comes with that good Enlightenment ideology. It's the doctrine of progress. So progress through like science, knowledge, and stuff like that is good. So again, kind of the spirit of empiricism. We like to study nature. And Houdon himself specialized in portraiture, and he depicted a lot of the major thinkers of the time, actually, including Diderot, Rousseau, Louis XVI, Catherine II of Russia, and Benjamin Franklin as well. So, and he was well known for capturing the look and the character of the sitter. So we can understand that this is probably what Voltaire looked like at this point. He was relatively old. But this is actually just a terracotta cast from the original plaster. But empiricism, we're looking at reality. We do get sagging skin on neck, the sunken mouth because he's toothless, and the slumping shoulders. Like, we're not trying to idealize him too much by getting rid of that. We are trying to show his character. Still has that sharp intellect and wit. He's more lively in spirit, although weak in body. And it has been classicized because of the Roman toga and headband. So it's also in an antique style chair as well. Some more stuff we get. This is also in the LACMA. This is a bust of George Washington, if you don't recognize him. A couple more Chads. This is Tommy J, my favorite, Thomas Jefferson. And then we also get this guy. I've talked about him a couple times, perhaps not as recognizable for most of us. This is Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Ben Franklin. Pretty recognizable. I wish I got to see his face more often, but I can never get $100 bills. This guy is also, he's perhaps more well known not for his neoclassical depictions, but he does do some. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang. And this is a cool one. It's not going to talk too much about it, but this is just the apotheosis of Homer. This is one of those more crowded ones I like. They feel more frontal. When they're more frontal like this, more in your face, I guess you get that planarity that neoclassicism likes. I kind of appreciate it more, perhaps. And you get the contemporary people, of course. Like, we got some classical Romans. This looks like Raphael over here, actually. I'm not sure if that is on the left. But on the bottom left, you get obviously more contemporary folks, and the bottom right as well is one I like as well. This is Bertel Thorvaldsen, a Dane. This is a famous statue of Jesus Christ, the Christus, and his 12 apostles as well. All unique, very cool, worth looking into more as well. Johann Zoffany, the academicians of the Royal Academy, 1772. So he was one of the founding members, another founding member of the British Royal Academy. And this guy over here, kind of in the middle, slightly to the left, in the black, is Sir Joshua Reynolds, the first president, of course. The guy on the far bottom left here is Zoffany himself, the artist. So he's showing himself with the palette and brush. And we get two male models on the right. That's who the naked dudes are. The question really, what's wrong with this picture, is these are all of the founding members. So obviously there's a good amount, right? The founding members of the Royal Academy. Except there were actually two women who helped found it as well. And they're in the portraits on the right. They're not actually in the painting. And those are Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser. So they were two founding members as well. Kauffman was kind of largely responsible for the popularizing of neoclassicism in England. Like, she definitely was pretty popular in her own time. And Moser's reputation, even at times, kind of rivaled Kauffman's. Ironic Yeah, because females were not allowed to paint nude male models. It was seen as indecent. So while we have naked models in the male dudes in the room, you can't be in the room, essentially. So they have become objects of art rather than its producers. Because we get all these other plaster casts and relief work and stuff on the left and throughout. So they've also just become works of art. They're objects of contemplation and inspiration for the male artists, not really seen as artists themselves. So it kind of just, I mean, I don't think it needed to necessarily be say in the sense that it's kind of obvious that women had a more difficult time being artists at that time. Lots of women, if they were a successful woman artist at this time, it was usually because your father or another close male relative trained you. Most of the time you would not actually get the professional training on your own if you just felt like it. And speaking of one of those female artists, here's an Angelica Kauffman. This is perhaps one of my favorites. This is Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures. So Kauffman herself was actually born in Switzerland. And she, again, like I kind of just said how it happens, she was trained by her father, who was an artist. But she studied in Rome, like most of the guys during this time. And she met and painted portraits of... She actually met and painted portraits of the German archaeologist Winkelmann as well. But she moved to London in 1766, and she was friends with Joshua Reynolds, and they actually painted each other portraits and stuff like that. And 2 years after she moved to London, the Royal Academy started, and she was a founding member and one of only 2 female founding members. And actually no more females would be admitted until about the 20th century. So, yeah. She actually opened her own salon, and it was pretty successful. So she was relatively influential in her time. It was even visited by Goethe, who was obviously a very famous writer. She actually passed away in 1807, and her funeral was organized by Antonio Canova, who we looked at the beginning. He was a sculptor. And this is pretty much a history painting, and she's really, she's not perhaps as famous as Mary Moser, largely because Kauffman is, really the only female history painter of the 18th century. She passes away pretty early in the 19th century, as I mentioned. But this is a story from Roman history. Most females at the time, and reasons why they perhaps weren't as famous, it was harder to get in, but they also weren't really generally... They were expected to paint portraits and still lives. They weren't really... I don't know if I would say allowed, necessarily, but essentially weren't allowed to do history paintings. They did not have such opportunities. Kauffman definitely had more opportunities than most women, especially female painters in her time. So this is a visiting friend on the right in the painting. She's showing off her jewelry to Cornelia Gracchus. You don't know who the Gracchi are. They're 2 very famous Roman politicians, to put it simply. And so, and Cornelia points to her kids and was like, oh, these are my jewels. And so she's kind of famous for motherhood. But she was also, because her sons were very powerful politicians, she was a powerful woman as well during her own time. This is during the Roman Republic. So Kauffman, I guess in that regard, is kind of looking up to her. So this becomes a relatively popular subject. We're kind of seeing more interest in the family unit, in painting it too, so it's a bit different in that regards. And we definitely, again, are still looking at the Enlightenment teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who advocated that parents should nurture their children at home, rather than sending them off to wet nurses and nannies until they were adolescents, which is very common if you were not aware, especially at least in European society. Mostly in more aristocratic circles, people who could afford it, you never breastfed your kid. You would hire a nurse who would breastfeed your kid, hence wet nurse. She was lactating. You had dry nurses who did not breastfeed. And then they would pretty much just be raised by nurses and nannies until they were older and the parents wouldn't actually bother to care about them, pretty much, which is just really weird. But Rousseau advocated that they should actually raise your children, pretty much. It seems really messed up, honestly, in hindsight, the idea of not raising your own kids, but in some circles this was normal, I guess, at the time. So, but that's changing here. We're listening to Rousseau saying you should actually be a parent. But we get this neoclassical elements again. We get that planarity. This is a very shallow space, kind of framed by the architecture, not as stark as David's architecture. And we actually get a little bit of mountains in the back, which I like. But we do get the linearity. This is a bit softer than David's, though. It doesn't seem as harsh. But we still do get tight brushwork. It's still very tight brushwork. It's not loose. The lighting is more even. We get the sculptural forms, of course. These are classical figures and themes, not as well as in the dress, but also just the moralistic, virtuous subject. And it is pretty austere, it's pretty bare. We get bare floors and walls. A kind of relatively more delicate version of neoclassicism. I actually quite like it. There is a tendency in today's day and age to perhaps appreciate an art just because, oh, this, I'm going to like this just because it is done by a woman. I think that's kind of ludicrous, despite, even if she was, it was more difficult for her in her own time. She'll like the art because it's good. And I think this one's actually really good. So here's your writing topics, my students. You don't actually have to do these. I have some of these. I don't know if I actually mentioned it in my introduction. These slides were borrowed, tweaked some more than others, from Sharon Duque, who's one of my professors and one of my mentors, and pretty much the reason I got a job teaching and I was able to teach adjunct for a year. So she's a great lady, and she is who I got these slides from. And I didn't delete all of her writing topics because although I don't expect you necessarily to write, I think they're good things to think about sometimes. But I mean, she painted stuff like, saying children are important. And I think it's kind of funny actually, like this lady's face, like, are you kidding me? It'll like peak for virtue signaling. Here is a self-portrait for Kaufman. The Swiss lady looks like. And here she is again. She actually did this quite frequently. She would paint herself next to allegories. This is the poetry next to her to inspire her. Another famous artist that's actually really popular during the Rococo period, and this is a Rococo style work actually that we're looking at. This is not neoclassical. This is Marie Louise Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Vigée-Lebrun is usually what we call her. She got a long name. This is Marie Antoinette. She was like the personal painter for Marie Antoinette, the court painter for her. And so there's a lot of portraits for her that are by Lebrun. And this is Rococo, but after the Revolution, Rococo stuff's frowned upon, so we're going to do this. It's a self-portrait with her daughter. It includes a daughter. Of course, family life seems more important. But also just very more neoclassical, wearing like a Roman dress with the headband again, just showing the impact of David's neoclassicism. She was self-taught because she was denied access to the Royal Academy. She just painted portraits as a teenager. And she technically was breaking the law doing that because she didn't have a license, which just seems kind of silly, but regardless. But she did marry a painter and an art dealer who kind of helped give her the contacts, and so she did become the favorite portraitist eventually of Queen Marie Antoinette. And actually she was allowed into the Royal Academy a bit later because of the Queen's influence. But this is, of course, reflecting that taste for the classical stuff and just showing the ideals of Rousseau with a greater parental involvement in child rearing. So you still kind of get this little bit of the Rococo influence in her stuff with those softer contours and more curvilinear patterns. But in this one, actually, I have this on a little like art journal I have. This painting is on the cover of it. I don't know where it was, or I might grab it. But this is at the Met in New York City. And it was originally attributed to Jacques-Louis David, but now it's attributed to Marie-Denise Villers, really. So she was a pupil of Anne-Louise Giraudet Toussaint. We do get some broken glass in the window. It's pretty much trying to show her skills, trompe l'oeil. And the room, as actually, we know it to be an actual place, been discovered to be a gallery in the Louvre, which was used by women to teach each other, pretty much, and to be instructed. So they think that, of course, this is a painting by a woman of a young woman. So, and the woman in the painting is, it says portrait of a young woman, but it has her name there, who they believe it is. It's pretty long again. I'm just not going to read that one. But we know that lady also once wanted to be a professional artist, but she actually chose instead to give up art when she got married. So, I mean, it happens, right? And in fact, that seemed to be like perhaps the norm for my students because I taught mostly art students, and lots of them were just got married, and it wasn't really a career or anything like that they were pursuing. This stuff too. This one's not as famous. This is probably the least famous of all the ones we're looking at, and these are just the works we've gone over pretty much. These are good works to know. Highly recommend looking at them if you're interested, especially of course the ones you're more particularly interested. I do have a slideshow of I have a slideshow of architecture. Well, it's pretty much actually just all of the coursework, like 19th century architecture, that's worth looking at. about first 15 slides are for neoclassical art. One good way to think about this is, what the hell is classical architecture? Like, what did the Romans do? You can think columns, arches, domes. Those are big three right there, pretty much. And that's what we're going to be doing again for neoclassical architecture. Honestly, not that hard to understand. And lots of it, at least in the United States, a lot of your government buildings, federal government buildings, but even a lot of local government buildings, and definitely state as well, are neoclassical in design. This is what's popular when the United States get founded, and it's kind of just become the standard. This is the Chiswick House. This is actually in London, well, near London, I guess. We get the Corinthian capitals, the fluted columns, pretty grand. Not as, like, and lots of Roman architecture and stuff like that is actually kind of feels relatively simple, but we also get a dome here. It's a house. How many people have houses with domes? Here's this too. This is in Bath, England, and these are all attached columns, like engaged columns. That's what we call them when they're not perfectly in the round. And these are more Ionic looking. Actually, they're kind of Ionic Corinthian-esque. I don't know. They look Corinthian over here, but more Ionic over there with the volutes. So I don't know exactly. Here's an interior, definitely classically inspired, with the Corinthian capitals. Kind of neat, orderly, precise. We got the pilasters on the left with Corinthian capitals as well. Like, not over the top. I don't have a Rococo or like Baroque interiors to show you, but those things are crazy. Like, they're wild. Like, this looks really good and sophisticated, and perhaps a bit, excess might still be a good word for this, for, people who aren't wealthy. That might be a word that comes to mind, like myself. But but it is a lot more orderly, precise, organized, and honestly less than the periods before it. So here's just a park in Wiltshire. Very nice, very orderly. This is the Pantheon in Paris, designed, of course, after the Pantheon in Rome. And this one is the church. And it's unlike the Pantheon in Rome, honoring, of course, a pantheon of deities. This kind of honors the illustrious modern French citizens. So we have a lot of influential Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau and Voltaire, like, depicted and stuff like this. And this is an interior. It's quite fantastic, but very classical, of course. Here's the facade of the Theatre Francais in Paris. This one seems a bit more muted. It might just be the color of the stone. But again, and the columns are a bit more simple. The capitals are very simple. Kind of just more Doric. But still neoclassical. Kind of the same thing here. Saltworks. Some perhaps more famous ones for the folks in America. Thomas Jefferson. He actually was like pretty much an amateur architect. Classical revival style definitely took off in America. We did design our government after the Republic of Rome, and a lot of our government buildings, of course, like I mentioned. But Thomas Jefferson did lots of his own stuff, being an amateur architect. He designed his own home. This is his home, Monticello. Looks pretty good. It seems, again, like relatively simple, because, again, it's not really over the top. He is also the founder of the University of Virginia, and he is the one that also designed the buildings there. He created actually 10 different Palladian villas, so each symbolizing a different classical building. So like a library at the end there with the Pantheon-like dome. So kind of the idea was to express individuality and unity of the new nation in its great foundation. So it's kind of classical and romantic at the same time, right? It's a bit romantic because we're evoking like a lost, distant past with this like picturesque variety, but it's obviously very classical in motif and stuff like that. This is in Baltimore, Maryland. Interior of the Baltimore Cathedral. Very classical, very neat. The White House, that same guy who did the Baltimore one did this. And he also did this, the U.S. Capitol building. Very classical, neoclassical period, definitely. So, never been to any of these places. And this is just another one that's like classical with the classical sculpture and relief up here. It's just a pretty elaborate tomb. The pyramid shape isn't really very classical. Well, you get triangular shapes with the pediments, but they're never this stark and steep. But either way, and this one's in Vienna, just for a rich lady, pretty much. So, yeah, pretty cool. that's pretty much all for now. Hopefully I didn't get too sidetracked. There wasn't really too much in the way of interaction, so how the lectures go is gonna vary depending on how many people are actually in the chat, I guess, the classroom, like, participating. Because I'll try to ask more questions if I know there are people there that can answer them, that are, or, are participating in the chat. So, and I got distracted talking to one of my buds, of course, too. And that will not be in the what I upload to YouTube. There's no point. But please let me know if you have any questions. Put them down in the comments. And I appreciate it. I'll be doing this perhaps next week, Wednesday. I'll probably try to aim for Thursday like I was originally planning for this week. But again, I have to be out of town tomorrow. And next week we'll start on Romanticism. Starting with Romanticism in Spain. It's actually quite simple. Pretty short. I think it might be my shortest set of slides that I have. I might try to expand it a bit, but it's looking like it's going to be a relatively quick stream next week, regardless, in a relatively smaller lecture. But yeah, either way, I really appreciate it. Please feel free to like and subscribe, as well as comment. If you don't have any questions, maybe just let me know what your favorite work was that we looked at, or maybe just favorite artists in general, and I will probably agree with you, because I think they're actually pretty much all of them that we looked at are good. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.